What the heck? I still don't get it. Okay, don't worry. There's some camera simulators you can play with before you actually get your camera and go out and make some images. So week 1, we're on the website. We're just going to scroll down. There's Be the Camera, Canon Outside Auto. If you have a Nikon, Olympus, it doesn't matter. The concepts work across all cameras. And this Anderson Image camera exposure simulator. So let's just click on one of these. I already had them open. So up here in the top of the frame, this is what you're looking for in your camera window. When you look through the camera, you're looking for that to be the exposure. So if you go 1, 2, 3 plus, you're overexposing, so the image is going to be brighter. And if you go 1, 2, 3 towards the minus, the image is going to get darker. So I'm going to start by setting my ISO, and I'm going to set my ISO to 400. Notice the grain that pops up in this simulator, so you can actually get a sense of the grain. Because why 400? Because that's where your first assignment is. Okay, so I want to have moderate depth of field. So I'm just going to come over here and set my my aperture. Aha! I must change this to manual. Okay, let's redo this. Okay, ISO 400. It's way overexposed. See how bright it is now? So I'm going to set my aperture to f8 because I want, moderate depth of field. But look at my meter here. I'm 2 stops overexposed. So now if I push to a higher, faster shutter speed, it's letting less light in, I'm balancing out my exposure. So notice now up here I'm dialed into the 0 or that line. I could keep going and it's going to get darker, but I want to try for the most part to line up my exposure. There are times where you'll need to compensate for different lighting conditions, but when you are just going out to get started, this is what you want to do. Okay, so let's say I want a shallow depth of field. I'm going to change my aperture. F2. Look at that. I can keep pushing this up, and look, I'm all the way up at my max of my shutter speed, and I can't get it lined up. It's still too bright. Well, what that tells me is that I'm going to have to compensate on my aperture. So let's take my aperture to f2.8 and I can line it up. So it's a dance between the shutter and the aperture to get your exposure looking good. I have a fly that's flying around me. Sorry about that, you guys. Okay, so maybe I want even greater depth of field. Look at how shallow the depth of field is behind the light bulb. So now if I push my aperture all the way up to f22, everything is way underexposed. So I need to then start pushing my shutter speed down. So if I want to be at f22, now my shutter speed is 1/30th of a second. Can I hand hold my camera at 1/30th of a second? Maybe, but 1/60th of a second is safer. So if I take this to 1/60th of a second, I can then adjust my aperture down to f16. Okay, so you can start to see that there's a dance between these. So give this a try and play with it. Okay, fly, where did you go? Okay, let's look at the next one. This is the Canon version. Now this one is fun because this actually has depth of field and movement happening in it. So like before, we need to make sure that we're set on manual. I'm going to set my ISO to 400. And you guys, you can play with the different ISOs while you're playing with the simulator just to get a sense of what they do. Okay, so my exposure now is down here on the bottom, and I'm a stop underexposed. So if I change my aperture to f5.6, it brightens it up. So the aperture is getting larger, not smaller, so it's letting more light in. And at 1/60th of a second, am I going to be able to stop that action? And at f5.6, I have pretty shallow depth of field. What happens if I push this up to here? And I change this down to here. So 1/4 of a second, we're going to see lots of movement, but at f16, I'm guessing that we are going to see some stopped action. So I'm going to click the little button, took an image. So now I've got great depth of field, foreground to background, middle ground included, and my propeller is blurred out. You can't even tell that there's a propeller there. So let's now this time crank this up to like 7/50th of a second, and then we're going to have to make an adjustment here. And look, I can't do that. I have to come all the way down to 1/250th of a second. And I'm going to hit the camera again. Let's see if we stop that action. It's starting to stop the propeller, but there's still a little bit of movement. Now, it's kind of getting tough. I need a higher shutter speed. I would like more depth of field. So I want like at least f8. And I want at least, what am I, 7/50th of a second? Let's go up to 1,000th of a second. But my meter just isn't working. So this is when I'm going to play with my ISO. I'm going to crank my ISO up. I have to go all the way up to 12,800 ISO in this room, it's indoors, to get 1/1000th of a second at f8. Let's see what happens. So it's almost stopped. I have pretty good depth of field, but I want more. This simulator doesn't show the noise, but we'd be having some serious noise here. But I just want you to play and experience lining things up. Think about stopping motion. Think about your depth of field. Think about compromises. Think about how those elements add to your story. And then the third one, it's called Be Your Camera. And you can focus on the foreground or the background. You want to choose manual. This one doesn't have an exposure, but it's right down here in the bottom of this EV. So as I crank up my ISO to 400, you can see it's getting darker. So I want to line that up till it says 0. So it's focused on the background. I'm going to focus on the foreground, the bear now. And I can dial this in a little bit. So aperture, shutter speed. So another one to play with. This one gives you some different types of images as well. With this, let's go this way. Whoa. So dialed in is right here. So we're at f6.3. You know, there's not a lot of great depth there. We're far away, so it's going to be all in focus from the foreground to the background. This is when we could be creative, and I would probably darken it down a little bit. So I can do that in camera, in image editing program. I could do this in Photoshop or Lightroom or some of the other options we're going to look at this semester. So play with all three of those. Have a good time. I'm going to hop back to the website really quickly and just take a look. There's a focus simulator and a lens simulator here as well. So go play with the simulators. And then one more video, we're going to talk about the project. And then make some images.